There are times in service where, like today, we don't want to just get caught in routine and checking things off the list, but we want to make room to allow God to begin to meet us. And the reality is sometimes we're in those moments and it seems like, well, why are we doing this? And maybe we didn't get anything out of it, but we don't know what the person on the other side of the sanctuary got out of that moment. Maybe God paused that moment just for them. I believe God's still got some stuff that he's going to do here this morning. We're going to jump in as we continue on. We are in week 3 of our series, Our DNA. And we've been talking about DNA for the last few weeks, kind of as our reminder point or our understanding point about how life is so similar and yet life is so different. Because every single human, whether here in this room or in Africa or China or any part of the world, shares 99% of the same DNA. DNA is like this long ladder with all these different steps, and as you stretch out this ladder, only by changing one out of every 1,500 or so steps on that ladder, all of a sudden, not only is every single one of us in this room different as we look around, but every single person in the world is different by only 1%. Something so small, and yet none of us are the exact same. It's almost like a family, right? Families are very similar, right? You've got the older generation, and then you've got the next generation, and as life goes on, you add in a third generation, so you've got the grandmas and the grandpas, and then you've got the moms and the dads, and then you add in the little Chays and Masanis running around, right? And there's this family structure that no matter what culture you go to, no matter what part of the world you're in, that structure is going to be very similar. And yet, how many know that your family's a little bit different? Right? Where I grew up, we had corn, right? I didn't grow up on chilies and fry bread and tortillas. I grew up on corn and soybeans. That was what was everywhere, right? We didn't have sheep. We had cows and pigs. My life growing up was a little bit different than what your life probably was. When I grew up, I was allowed to watch as much TV as I want, for better or worse. I was allowed as much TV as I wanted to watch. I would watch TV. However, I was not allowed to watch anything I wanted. Right? There was things my parents said, you will not watch this kind of show. You will not watch this. You won't watch this movie. Turn your head because you don't need to see what's going on right now. Right? I could watch as much TV as I wanted, but I couldn't just watch anything I wanted. When I grew up, I didn't have to take off my shoes when I come into the house. Other people, where you grew up, the first thing you do, right? Unless you want to get hit with your mom's flip-flop, you take off your shoe when you walk in the house, right? Different families, different rules, different experiences. Some families grew up eating at the table. Some, everybody eats on their own. Some, they just eat throughout the house whenever they want. Different families, different experiences. And yet, you still got this similar structure. Every family is just a little bit unique. Every home is just a little bit unique. One of the things you see every week when you walk into church here, right after you walk in the front doors, it says right over before you walk in the sanctuary, it says, welcome home. When you look at the countdown, when you look at different slides that go through before service, it says, welcome home. That's what our desire is for the church, is that when people come into the church, that they're not just coming in to a church, but that from the moment they pull in from the parking lot, they pull off the road, we've got signs out there, join us, welcome. We've got signs for our guests where they can specifically park, where we want them to feel like they are valued and belong. Where they walk in, we've got the coffee and we've got the comfortable chairs there. It's not just so we can be comfy, it's because we want it to feel like home. And it's not only the design and the layout, but it's we want to be a people. That when people walk into our church, they feel like they belong, they feel loved. For people who don't have a family at home or whose home life is broken, that they can come here and find the things that they've always dreamed of, as you and I get to become a family for the community as we grow deeper together. We desire to be an oasis. And just like your DNA is different than anybody else's, just like your family is different, our church is going to have a lot of similarities with other churches. But there's also going to be some things that make us different. So what is it that's our DNA? What is it that makes our family just a little bit maybe different? What do we value? The family structure is the same, but what is it that makes our family a little bit unique? Well, some of the things that, whether you want to call them family rules, right? We're calling it DNA in this series. But the things that we value here at Oasis Church, one of the things we value is that we speak the truth in love. We will always preach the Bible uncompromised. We will not change what the Bible says for anybody. We will speak the truth of the Bible, but we make sure that when we speak that truth, we speak it with love. In the way that we speak it and what we speak, that it's not just speaking the truth, but it's done because we love somebody. And we say it in a loving way that they can receive. We speak the truth in love. One of the other things we value here at the church is we actively worship. We looked last week at Joshua in the book of Joshua as he led the Israelites into war, but what he did is he did it through worship. Not just in singing a song, that was a part of it, but it was a lifestyle of obedience that Romans tells us this is your worship, that you offer yourself as a living sacrifice, that we understand that when we follow Jesus, our life doesn't belong to us anymore. That it's not just about say this prayer after me and we say the prayer and life is all better, but that as we begin to follow Jesus, that my life now belongs to him. So it's no longer my opinions, it's no longer my thoughts, it's no longer my desires, but it's all surrendered and sacrificed to him through worship. And that as we worship in our lifestyles, we worship through song, the Bible says it opens up doors for the presence of God to begin to work in our lives. We actively worship because we know that worship is warfare. As we go into week 3 this week, one of the other things that we're going to talk about today, and as we are going into this, I had really thought, I was like, well, all of these are important, which is why you can call them core values. That would be the business term for this series, right? These core values. And I'm like, well, they're all important, but as we were going into this week, I had this realization that this is one of the things that if we get this wrong, we get everything wrong. That this week is that important. That if we had to pick one thing to get right, it has to be this one. We always preach the Bible, but we have got to get this one right. As a church, we invest in the next generation. Because the church of tomorrow is the next generation. And the church today will not be here tomorrow if we aren't reaching out to the next generation. And this is something that has been my heart. Before I was ever a pastor here at the church, I was a youth pastor. The next generation. Beginning those investments. As we've come into the church and we're doing things, there's things that we've dreamed and talked about, but I believe God is taking us from a dreaming season to a season of walking it out. We've walked through a season where the sanctuary was falling apart, and Kayla and I would tell you as we're raising money, this is what is one day going to be here. You'd walk in here throughout that 2-year process, and we'd walk you through and say, well, eventually on this wall over here, there's going to be this wood, and in this corner, there's going to be this chairs, and this is where the cost, and we begin to dream and tell you this is what we see is there until now we get to sit in here every day and we see those things up. There has been things that we have dreamed and talked about for the last few years for the next generation that I believe God is beginning to transition us and saying it's no longer time to just dream about it, but the time is coming to begin to walk it out. Because if we miss the next generation, then we miss everything. As a church, we invest in the next generation. If we go back to last week and we talk about worship and you look at the last several years from where we were to where we are now, and you say, well, why do we do this style of worship? Why does the sanctuary look the way it does now? It's for the next generation. Because you can worship to hymns and all the old music just as much as you can worship to what we did today. It's not about one style or the next, but it's about the next generation creating a place where we can disciple and train them in a way that's going to connect with them, where we keep the gospel, we keep the Bible, we keep that foundation, we don't compromise it. But Paul said this, he said, I became all things to all people. Right? To the Jew, I became Jew. To the Greek, I became Greek. To the Roman, I became Roman. He adapted himself to the personality of who he was trying to reach. If we want there to be a church tomorrow, then we've got to stand on our foundation. Paul didn't compromise the gospel. He never changed Jesus depending on who he was talking about, but he changed how he presented Jesus depending on who he was talking to. If we want to reach the next generation, we're going to begin to prioritize how are we as a church going to reach those who are in the next generation, to make this a place that they want to be, to make this a place where they feel welcome. Because if we don't meet them where they are, then they're going to stay out there. Nobody's going to find them. Nobody's going to get them in. And so we invest in the next generation. A good leader, a good church, a good organization will lead well, and they will impact in their lifetime. But the best ones leave an impact on their time, and they invest in the next generation so that things keep going after they're gone. This is true in the business world. This is true in the church. And most importantly, this is true in your family. It's great that grandma's been in church for 30 years. It's great that you're in church right now. But when you go, if your children aren't in church, if your children don't know Jesus, if the next generation doesn't know how to follow Jesus for themselves when grandma or mom and dad is gone, then we've missed it. We can't just be content that we know how to follow God, but we have got to invest in those who are coming behind us. We can't just celebrate that, hey, look what God has done. We've got a brand new sanctuary and celebrate what God has done in our lifetime. We've got to make sure that this is the foundation that has been laid for the next generation, that the next generation, as they come, they say this church can't even hold them anymore. They don't need a new sanctuary. They need a new building to hold what God is doing. It's not enough to just be content with our generation. We've got to invest in the next generation. And here's the dangerous thing. As we look through the Bible, there are incredible men and women who did incredible things, but one mistake that many of them made, even the best, is they forgot to invest in the next generation. They've got a life and a legacy that when we look at their story, it's incredible, but it ends with heartbreak because their life ends and the story for the next generation is very different than what it was for the heroes that we read about. One of the first leaders in the Bible, his name was Moses. The book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, it ends with Israel, the man, heading down to the country of Egypt because there's a famine. And so he takes his family down there during the famine, and they're able to get food, and they're able to take care. And time passes, and the book of Exodus opens up. As time has passed, the famine is over. That generation passed away. A new generation comes up. The Pharaoh doesn't know about Joseph, Israel's son. He doesn't know how he helped Egypt. And it says that the Egyptians began to oppress the Israelites and put them in slavery. And eventually time passes and God finds a man named Moses. Moses had committed murder. He had grown up in Egypt and committed murder. He ran away. He hid in the desert. At this point, he'd gone from living in the Pharaoh's house, living as the king's son, to now he was a shepherd. He had fallen quite a ways. But Moses is out there, and God meets him in this Moses and says, Moses, you're the one that I want to lead my people. I want you to set them free. I've heard them. They're crying out to me. They're praying. They're broken. They're going through this incredible hard time, and no more. Moses, I'm sending you because it's time for them to be free. And so Moses goes down. He begins to deliver the people, and then he begins to, all these plagues happen. He takes them out of Egypt. They come to the Red Sea. He splits the Red Sea, leads this entire nation across. They get across. All of a sudden, they turn around on their enemies. They find freedom for the first time in years. And now they've got to learn, how are we even supposed to follow God? They don't know what it means to follow God. They know that God is there as the God of their grandfather Abraham, right, of their ancestor Abraham. And so they're trying to figure it out. And God begins to speak to Moses and give them these different laws and commands. And eventually, God sets up and he says, I want you to create this place, and we're going to call it the tent of meeting, Moses, and you're going to set this outside. The Israelites are going to camp over here, and then I want you to set up the tent of meeting here outside of the camp. And Moses, when you need to hear from me, when you need direction, when you need to learn, when you need to know what decisions to make, I want you to meet me at the tent of meeting. And so they're learning how to worship. As they're learning how to do this, then Exodus chapter 17, we come across Joshua for the very first time in the Bible, who we talked about last week. Joshua would become the second leader of the Israelite people. But when we first meet him, he's a young man who's leading the Israelites in battle. And it says that Moses is up on the mountain. He's got two other men beside him. They're holding up his arms. And as long as Moses' arms are up, they win the battle. But it's Joshua, when we meet him, that's down there leading the Israelites in battle. But Moses saw something in Joshua in that battle, because the moment comes where all of a sudden Joshua becomes Moses' aide, his helper, his assistant. And Moses begins to train Joshua in the ways of the Lord. Let's look at the tent of meeting, Exodus chapter 33, verses 9 through 11. As Moses went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and stay at the entrance, while the Lord spoke with Moses. Whenever the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, they all stood and worshiped, each at the entrance to their tent. And the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. And then Moses would return to camp, but his young aide Joshua, son of Nun, did not leave the tent. See, Moses was training Joshua to be in the presence of God. Now, Joshua's responsibilities may have been to guard that tent, to make sure that there is honor and reverence to God, that nobody else would enter it haphazardly, because again, they were still learning. Right? There was many times where it was like the people would do something wrong and fire would fall from heaven, snakes would come in and bite. Like they were learning, like there's ways that you honor and treat God. And so part of Joshua's responsibility of the tent may have just been to make sure that nobody came in without honoring God the way they were supposed to, and to make sure that nobody but Moses was entering that tent. But one of the things we know is that Moses was training Joshua, and so Joshua stayed at the tent where the presence of God dwelt. Moses didn't need to train Joshua to be a warrior. Joshua already knew that. But he needed to train Joshua that you need to know how to be in the presence of God. You need to know how to follow God, how to hear from God, how to walk in relationship with God. Moses was investing in the next generation. He was investing in those who would lead after him. He was forward thinking, not thinking about his comfort, not thinking about his title, not concerned about himself, but worried about the next generation being equipped to do what God was calling them to do. And so Moses trained up Joshua to seek and follow God. And eventually the time came where Moses died. Joshua became the next leader. It opens up with Joshua that we read last week as they fight the battle of Jericho. And then all of a sudden from Jericho, they began to fight battle after battle as they conquer the promised land. And it is an incredible time to hear the stories that they would have heard growing up, that God made this promise to our ancestor Abraham, and that one day we're going to take this, and now God has heard our cry, and we're out of Egypt, and he's done all these great miracles, and he's taken us through the desert for 40 years. He parted the Red Sea. He provided manna and quail, and we stepped into the promised land, and God began to give them victory everywhere. Every story they had grown up hearing began to be fulfilled in their lifetime as they watched all this happen. It was an incredible time as Joshua led them to take over the promised land. But look at this next verse. It speaks of Joshua and his generation. And I believe that this scripture, partnered with some of the others that we're going to read today, are the absolute scariest things that we can read in the Bible. They are some of the most heartbreaking moments that you'll ever find. After Joshua passed away, came the time of the judges in Israel. Judges chapter 2, and I found this, the New English translation. I like the way they worded it. And it says this, speaking of Joshua's generation, that entire generation passed away. And a new generation grew up that had not personally experienced the Lord's presence or seen what he had done for Israel. Joshua and his generation grew up worshiping that when the presence of God fell on the tent of meeting, they each went to the door of their tent and they began to worship. They began to bow down. They began to understand what it was to reverence God. They're the ones that experienced conquering the promised lands. They're the ones that experienced deliverance from Egypt. And yet somewhere along the way, a generation grew up that didn't get passed on to. A generation grew up who did not personally experience the Lord. It doesn't matter how much we experience the Lord if we don't open the door for the next generation to experience them for themselves. Not just the stories of yesterday. Those stories are meant to build faith, but we've got to provide a space for the next generation to encounter the presence of God for themselves so that it's no longer, well, I go to church because my grandma went to church. Well, I'm a Christian because my grandma or my mom or my dad is a Christian, but I'm a Christian because I have encountered the presence of God in my life. It's not just a story that somebody else told me. It's not just something I read about in the Bible, but it's because I have been in those moments in worship where God's presence touched me. I've been in those moments in life where I didn't have anywhere else to turn and God showed up. We've got to invest in the next generation because they can't live off of our stories. They've got to have their own encounter with God. A generation grew up that had never experienced the presence of God. And you know what it says in verse 11? Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. In a single generation, there's a shift from the people who experienced the promises of God, who conquered the promised land, to a generation who never experienced the presence of God. Because they never experienced the presence of God, they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And this opened up the door to the cycles we see in Judges, where it's they follow God and then they fall into sin and they're oppressed. And then somebody comes along and they follow, and it opened up the cycle because it didn't get passed on to the next generation. We don't want to be the generation that lives in blessing if it means that we are setting up the next generation to live in the bottom of the cycle where they miss out on the things of God. We invest what God has done in us into the next generation. We prioritize the next generation. Here at Oasis Church, we invest in the next generation because it's not just enough that we worship and follow God today. We want our children and grandchildren to worship and honor God tomorrow. Joshua was an incredible warrior. He was an incredible leader. But where Moses had invested in him, Joshua failed to raise up another leader to follow after him. It is a deadly and dangerous mistake, but it is an all too common one. 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. As Elijah and Elisha were walking along and talking, suddenly a fiery chariot pulled by fiery horses appeared. They went between Elijah and Elisha, and Elijah went up to heaven in a windstorm. And while Elisha was watching, he was crying out, my father, the chariot and horsemen of Israel." And then he could no longer see him. And so he grabbed his clothes and he tore them in two, and he picked up Elijah's cloak, which had fallen on him, and went back and stood on the shore of the Jordan. He took the cloak that had fallen off Elijah, he hit the water with it and said, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" And when he hit the water, it divided, and Elisha crossed over. If you look at the life of Elijah in 2 Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, Elijah was a prophet who did absolutely incredible things. Elijah came up one day and he declared with a word from the Lord, he said, "It's not going to rain for 3 years." And for the next 3 years, they experienced no rain in Israel. 3 years pass and Elijah shows back up. The king, of course, hates the man who just said it's not going to rain. Shows back up before the king and has this big showdown, calls down fire from heaven. Says, all right, let's show him who the real God is. And he begins to pray. And all of a sudden, after no rain for 3 years, Elijah prays and rain begins to come. Elijah raised people from the dead. Elijah struck a water of the Jordan. He began to walk across the river on dry land. All these incredible things. And somewhere along the way, Elijah comes across a man named Elisha. It says Elisha is literally out there plowing his field with his oxen. Right? Elisha's just at work. He's going about his day. He's got things to plant. And Elijah comes up, and Elisha is invited to follow. Elijah knew that although God had done great things through him, that it wasn't enough that he did great things, but that there needed to be somebody who came next. And so he began to invest in the next generation into a man named Elisha. As we read through the Bible, Elisha did significantly more miracles than Elijah ever did. When Elijah went up to heaven, as we just read, it says that Elisha was there to pick up the cloak. He was there to pick it up like the baton being passed. He was there to carry the work that Elijah had done because Elijah made sure that there was somebody there to carry forward what he had begun. But just like we read the end of Elijah's life just now, where he was taken up in a whirlwind to heaven and Elisha picks up his cloak, the Bible also records the end of Elisha's life. Elisha picked up that cloak, hit the water with it. The water split, his first miracle. But he would go on to raise the dead. He would go on to call bears down on children for calling them bald. That was my dad's favorite threat when I was a kid. Right? Elisha did many more miracles than Elijah ever did. And this is the end of his life. 2 Kings 13:20. Elisha died and was buried. That's it. Elisha, who had done more miracles than Elijah, Elisha died and was buried. Following this moment, Elisha was buried, and eventually a man would be thrown in the same tomb as Elisha. He would land on his bones. He would come back to life, but that's the end of the story. Where Elisha had picked up Elijah's cloak and carried on that mantle, there was nobody to carry the mantle when Elisha died. Elisha, who had done so many miracles, didn't have anybody to carry on after him. He had missed investing in the next generation. Elisha took up the mantle of Elijah, but no one would carry the mantle after Elisha. Lastly, this morning, let's look at a man named Hezekiah. If you're reading through the Bible in 1 year with us, we just read his story just within the last couple weeks. Hezekiah was not just a good king. After King David came King Solomon, and then Israel split. Just like America, you've got the Civil War. Israel split. There was 11 tribes or 10 tribes that became Israel, and then there was Judah. Two completely separate nations came to be. And as you compare them, the Bible looks at Judah, and Judah had more good kings than Israel, but it says that even out of all the kings that Hezekiah, it says there was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. When you look at the nation of Judah at that time, Hezekiah was one of the best kings that Judah had. But look at his mindset in investing towards the next generation. 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 16 through 19. Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Listen to the Lord's message. Look, a time is coming when everything in your palace and the things that your ancestors have accumulated to this day will be carried away to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. Some of your very own descendants, whom you father, will be taken away and will be made eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And Hezekiah said to Isaiah, the Lord's message, which you have announced, is appropriate. And then he added, at least there will be peace and stability during my lifetime. Imagine this for just a moment, because what God just told Hezekiah, right? Imagine that you're in your house. You've got everything you've been working for your entire life. You've got everything that your family has worked for generations, your land, your property. And God comes up and he says that all of this is going to be taken away, that everything you have is going to be stripped bare, that your children and grandchildren who are going to be direct descendants of you are going to be made eunuchs. That means they're going to lose all their rights. They're going to not marry. They're going to be slaves and servants in somebody else's household. And Hezekiah's like, cool, that's fair. We're a wicked people. At least I'm going to be good. That was his mindset. Everything is going to be taken. Everything is going to be destroyed. And Hezekiah's like, that's fair, God. That's fair. But at least in my lifetime, everything's still here. Church, we cannot afford to be a people who say, well, at least in my lifetime, the church prospered. At least in my lifetime, things were going well. At least in my lifetime, things were good. We've got to be mindful of the next generation, that we are investing in them and preparing for their future, that we would say it's not just enough for me to follow God, but I want to make sure that this church is healthy and thriving 50 years from now, that when my grandchildren are growing up, that they would have a place in this community to come and encounter the presence of God, because he is the only one that can change their life. And so it's not enough that things are good today, but I've got to ensure that they're going to be better tomorrow. Proverbs 13:22 says, a good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children. This is Solomon that wrote the Proverbs. The guy's life was a mess at the end. But at this point, he was honoring God. He was following God. He knew what he was talking about. And he says, a good person. This isn't even great. Right? This isn't even like an excellent person. This isn't even a person. He's like a good person. Leaves an inheritance, not just to their children, but to their children's children. If we want to be a good church, I think we want to strive for more than good, but if we want to be a good church, we better be leaving a mark, not just for us, but for our children's children. That when those who are sitting in here today, those who are sitting at the back that are coloring right now, those who can't even talk yet, we better make sure that we're leaving something for them. We better make sure that this is a place that they can encounter God's presence, and you and I have got to lead the way. We've got to train them. How are they going to learn to worship if we don't worship? How are they going to learn what it means to be faithful if we aren't faithful? The reality is, we're generally the lid for our children. People generally don't, on natural, push past what they see. Those are the outliers. Those are the exceptions for somebody to go beyond what was modeled for them. At best, we reach the level that was modeled for us. But generally, we actually fall below that. Parents, if we are not passionately pursuing Jesus, if we aren't prioritizing church, we can't expect our kids to even care about church. We've got to invest in the next generation, the way that we live, the example that we set. Are we prioritizing for our family what it means to follow God? Are we investing something that there is going to be an inheritance, not just of money, not just of land, not just a place to call home, but a spiritual inheritance for our children's children? Will we be able to go in the future and tell our grandchildren, this is the story of how God changed my life, and this is who he is for you, that they can begin to encounter him for themselves? Because the reality is, the church is only ever one generation away from extinction. We can't take for granted today that one generation gets to experience revival, the next generation considers that normal, and the third generation has completely forgotten them. We've got to be a generation who passes it on, the fire and the love for God as we invest in the next generation. Jesus taught his disciples to love the children, to welcome them. Acts 21 mentions Philip the evangelist, and it says that he had 7 daughters who prophesied. It's passing it on to the next generation. The last half of the book of Acts tells us about the apostle Paul. This is the man who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, the last half of the Bible. And Paul made it a priority to invest. He knew that he wasn't going to be around forever. He knew that eventually he was going to give his life for the gospel, but along the way, he took along a young man named Timothy, and he began to train up Timothy to lead and to preach the gospel. He took along a young man named Titus, and he says, Titus, this is what you need to do to preach the gospel and to be a leader. We've got to be investing in the next generation. Not just haphazardly, not just general conversations like, well, if you want to talk about God, that's cool, but prioritizing and saying, God has got to be the focus of your life. It doesn't matter if we can leave an inheritance for our kids where they've got a sports car and a large house if they don't know Jesus. For those of you who have kids right now, I want to encourage you, lead the way to Jesus because they're watching you. I was just talking to somebody, matter of fact, just this morning, that's got a little girl. And I noticed in worship, I'm going to call Miko out. Normally I wouldn't call somebody out, but this is a good thing. So we're going to recognize Miko and Savea this morning. A couple weeks ago, we've got on our media team a front row person. It means they sit up here, and if something's going on with the music, or like this morning, felt the Holy Spirit saying, hey, I feel like we need to add on something at the end after worship so we can go into this time. We've got somebody that can pass that back to the sound booth without us always having to run back there. Miko was running that just a couple weeks ago and was sitting up here, and normally Savea's over here on this corner, but because Mom was here, Savea was on this corner by me that Sunday morning, and we were in the middle of worship, not the kids' song, our worship service, and I just began to hear this little voice behind me worshiping God passionately. It's because Miko's been making decisions in the last year of her life that she's going to prioritize God. And that decision is being passed on to the next generation because she's watching her mother, and it's catching on. Your kids are watching you, parents. They're watching. Are we just going to church because it's Sunday and what we do is what I see on Sunday the same thing as what I see at home? Is the way you talk on Sunday the same way you talk at home? Is the things you talk about when you talk about Jesus and loving people, is that reflected in the way that you talk with the people in your home? Is it actually reflecting love in the way that you act? They're watching you. More than our job, more than anything else, I fully believe that the greatest call in any person's life when they become a parent is to take care of the children. And you may say, well, I don't have kids. If you're an auntie, if you're an uncle, if you've adopted kids, that investment into the next generation is the most important thing we can do. How are we discipling our children? How are we discipling the kids around us? Make them come to church. There are times where I didn't want to go to church growing up. Probably not a good attitude for a pastor, but that's just what it was, right? Guess what? My parents didn't care, right? Sunday mornings, I went to church. Sunday night, guess what? They didn't have kids' church on Sunday night. So you know what I did? I sat in the church, and I sat on the floor, and I faced the little chairs just like that, and I would have a coloring book, and I would color, but I was there in church. There's got to be times we may have to force our kids into some things, but if it means that we get them introduced to Jesus, then it's worth it. And it's not about indoctrination. It's not about forcing something on them. It's about, you know what? Your kid doesn't want to take medicine either, but you know they've got to take it to get better. Your kid may not want to come to church, but they need Jesus. We've got to invest in the next generation. We've got to prioritize it as a church, as families, as fathers and mothers, as aunts and uncles. At Oasis Church, it is in our DNA, an unchangeable part of who we are, that we invest in the next generation. Whether it's having coloring pages until we get a kids ministry, whether it's starting with a worship song that seems a little bit unique from other churches when we have a kids song every single week. Whether it's things like Easter or VBS or back to school or the trunk or treat, doing whatever it takes to begin to build bridges. Whether it's changing the church and adding colored lights and doing a different style of worship, doing whatever it takes to invest in the next generation, because they are the future of this church.